7% of the kids who go to school in this country attend fee-paying schools. Those fees are going up and up every year. As one of the parents with their child at private school, I know full well families using private schools pay an average of £14,200 a child. Boarding school fees have reached some of £40,000 on average. However, there is a call from the Labour Party. They're looking at putting VAT on school fees, adding an extra 20% to those fees because they say, school fees are only exempt from VAT because schools are regarded as charities. But if they're private fee-paying schools, are they really charities? And should they actually get that exemption? Well, this time now, the heads of those various private schools are hitting back. They've issued their annual report for the Independent Schools Council, and they've claimed that private schools aren't costing the taxpayer money. On the contrary, they're saving the taxpayer £20 billion a year. How? Well, they say they're educating pupils who would otherwise need state places, and they're providing employment, community facilities and tax contributions as well. And that actually it is they who are an addition to the economy of the country rather than being a drain by not paying VAT. Well, let's debate all of this now with Toby Young. He's a former director of the New Schools Network, the free schools charity, set up his own local school, and also Francis Gilbert, who's a teacher and author of The Mindful English Teacher. Good morning to you, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning. Toby Young, let me come to you first on this. I have to say, when I pay my child's school fees, which I'm in a very privileged position to be able to afford to do, I've only got the one on a good income. It is wildly outside of the realms of most people on average incomes or even good incomes ability to afford to pay, especially if they've got more than one child. I never think that I'm contributing to a charity. I'm paying private school fees, paying for a good quality education for my child, which I'm lucky to be able to afford. There's any reason why that should be exempt from VAT at 20%?
Well, I think the argument made, there are two arguments here, Julia, and we should be careful to distinguish them. The first argument is that people like you who send their children to independent schools are saving the taxpayer money. And that's true whether they have charitable status or not. And the reason that's true is because if you weren't sending your child to a private school, you'd send your child to a state school. And if your child was at a state school, then the bill for teaching your child would be payable by the taxpayer. So roughly 7% of the population of Britain's school children are educated privately, and that's 7% that would otherwise be educated in the state sector. And the taxpayer would have to foot the bill, and the Independent Schools Council estimates that the savings to the taxpayer is about 3.5 billion. And I think that's a pretty solid argument. The other argument, which is I think more controversial, that independent schools should continue to enjoy charitable status. I think the argument there is, well, first of all, they're set up as charities. They're not for-profit companies. And in order to be a charity, you have to engage in various charitable works. What do independent schools do? Well, for instance, the local independent schools are the school I helped set up. Lets the children at our school use its swimming pool. It sometimes lets it use its playing fields. One of their teachers is on the governing body of my school. Independent schools, I think, in total provide completely free education to about 6,000 pupils, and about a third of pupils altogether at independent schools are on bursaries of one kind or another. You can argue that they ought to be doing more to justify their charitable status, but I think you can't claim that they're not doing anything and that they're not legally charities. That was challenged under Tony Blair, but challenged unsuccessfully. The schools were able to demonstrate in court when challenged that they were in fact charities and were entitled to their charitable status.
OK, Francis Gilbert, now you're a teacher in a state school. Do you think that actually we should be saying, well, thank goodness for all those lovely parents who are paying to send their kids to private schools. They're saving the taxpayer a fortune in money, and they should absolutely keep that charitable status. What would you say to that?
Not at all. I'm actually a teacher educator, and I serve quite a lot of very poor, state schools in poor areas in South London. We help supply them with sort of new teachers, as it were. Private schools create massive social inequality in this country, and we know this through decades of evidence and comparing with other countries. They suck out the richest students from the state system, and that causes quite, I would say, financial difficulties for the state system, because you haven't got the richest parents helping out with the state system in a multitude of ways. And it's a very, very bad situation, because what you've got is richer people just buying their way out of the state system, and it's very unhealthy for social cohesion in this country.
But hold on a minute. But I mean, but we do. But second, wait a minute. We have. Francis.
Privately educated people, because they've bought their way out of the system. What you really need to do is get rid of the private schools and put everyone together, so that we have local community schools, and people of children from poorer backgrounds are mixing with children from richer backgrounds.
Okay, but Francis, can I please get away? The key issue there is that you know that even in the state system, better off, rich, middle-class, sharp-elbowed parents always effectively buy their way out of the poorest schools by moving to the catchment areas of the better schools. We see this with it's the faith schools, that's selection by the back door, or the really good comprehensives, or even the grammar schools. People move into the area, they get their kids to the grammar schools. The sharp-elbowed, rich middle classes will always be able to make sure their kids aren't at the worst schools. We're always going to have those social differences. Why do we say that parents shouldn't they can be allowed to buy more expensive clothes for their child? They can go on more expensive holidays. They can buy more gadgets or more books for their child. They can afford to have nannies or afford not to work and stay at home, look after all of those things. Are you saying uniquely, though, they shouldn't be allowed to spend money on their child's education?
Our state schools are impoverished. We've been hit by massive austerity cuts, and we need as much help as we can from other wealthier parents to get back into the system. It's a shocking state of affairs at the moment. The Tories have reduced state schools too, and we've got facing a situation where state school teachers are buying books and food for their pupils. That just came out a few weeks ago. It's a shocking, terrible system that we've got. We need to put much more money into the state system. We need to get rid of the private schools and have the wealthier students who would benefit from mixing with a wider social network.
Well,
a lot of the problems in this country are caused by the fact that children from wealthy backgrounds have no contact with poorer students at all. They don't understand how society works. They don't understand the majority of kids in this country.
I mean, I'm going to put those points to Toby Young. Now, you yourself, you started a state school yourself, a free school. They're not allowed to be, academically or socially, financially selective. Do you think the answer to the problems in the state system is we got rid of private schools? I certainly was of a view for some years that actually, if the sort of, again, middle class parents like me were forced to be in the system, we'd make darn sure that the state school system was better than it is. But is that an argument against personal freedom that justifies it?
Well, I think the problem with Francis's argument is that if you closed down private schools, effectively forcing parents like you, Julia, to send their children to state schools, then state schools would have to educate more children, and so they'd have less money to spend per child. So if you're worried about cuts to state school funding, and incidentally, the cuts aren't nearly as severe as critics of the present government maintain. State school funding on a real terms per pupil basis increased by about 100% between 1997 and 2010, and since then there's been a cut of about 6%. I mean, he says that we heard about this on the radio a few weeks ago. Well, what we heard was a head teacher complaining that she was now having to clean the toilets in her school. Turned out she was on £130,000 a year and had got a £10,000 raise the previous year. So I do think that all this talk of severe Tory austerity cuts in the state school sector is wildly exaggerated. But the solution is not to force parents like you to send their children to state schools by shutting down private schools, because that would mean that state schools pay even less money. I think that's a fair point. I don't think it's true what Francis says, that children at independent schools never meet poor children. I mean, after all, if a third of the children in the independent sector are on bursaries of one kind or another, and 6,000 children are on 100% bursaries, then of course they meet people from all walks of life in those schools. And I think it's true what Francis says, broadly speaking. It would be ideal if we had an education system in this country in which everyone, no matter what their class background, sent their children to the same sorts of schools. But the way to do that is not to force people to by making private schools illegal. It's by raising standards in the state sector.
Let me give the final word to Francis on this. Isn't that the argument that actually, there are lots of countries where they don't have a big private sector in terms of education, but that's because the parents don't want it because they're very happy with the education their children are getting in the state system. Isn't that the argument?
You only have to look at the most successful school system in the world, Finland, to notice that they actually made a strategic plan in the 1970s to close down the private schools.
They didn't ban them.
They didn't ban them, but they made it very difficult to set them up. And they had a plan as a society, and they felt that all our children should be mixing together, and we should be learning together as a community. And they had that vision, and that's led to them being the most successful state school system.
But I've got to be honest with you, Francis, I'd
So
be really happy for my child to be at state school as I went to. If any of the children at my local state school that my child could have got into could read and write, which they couldn't when they were up. My child would have been a teaching assistant at the local school, judging by the standards they've got there. I didn't think that was fair on her.
That's just one anecdotal example.
Yes,
my own child went to the local comprehensive, and he did extremely well. So
I went to a comp.
So it's not. But overall, we do know, the research shows that if you do have a strategic plan as a society to shut down private schools, your education system will become a lot more successful.